Hello and welcome once again to White Lotus of Light conversational series. This is part of the masculine and feminine series that I'm doing, and I am very blessed and honored and thrilled today to have Mary Allison with me. And Mary Allison is in my opinion, we talked about it beforehand, and she didn't have a biography yet that's been written out, and so I would describe her as a woman who is a spiritual teacher who's on the cutting edge among her generation of being a spiritual teacher. She is a mystic. She is a woman who really holds the divine feminine frequency. Her writings are beautiful and poignant and poetic even, and she really goes right to the depth of source. And I feel there is a transmission in her writing that is very uplifting and healing to even read. And I've brought Mary Allison on today. I wanted to have her on the show for a while, but for this specific episode, we're going to be talking about some of the topics that were in my previous video with Roderick Z about the masculine and the feminine. But I wanted to bring on a woman who holds that divine feminine frequency in order to relate the experience of being a woman with all the issues that we talked about in that video. And so how are you doing today, Mary Allison?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you. It's so good to be with you today.
Yeah, fantastic. And so I want to talk about a number of different things today, but I think where I want to open is I'm just curious what your perspective is on. Actually, I think we'll open with something like pretty broad-based. Is this year we've seen a lot of what I feel like is a lot of artificially induced tension between men and women with social engineering. With it started with the Chris Rock slap at the Will Smith, Chris Rock, Jada Pinkett Smith
Yeah.
thing. Then the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp. Then, of course, Roe versus Wade. And most recently, in a similar vein, is the social media deplatforming of Andrew Tate, who I am not a fan of him at all. I don't care for him. I do know a couple of people that I really respect that weirdly like this man and think that he's unfairly has been unfairly propagandized against, much the way that Trump was. Again, also not a huge fan of Trump. I like Trump better than Biden, but that's a low bar. And so think about this current toxic environment and just an overview sense of between the masculine and feminine energies.
Yeah, I think if anyone has an intuitive capacity, they would naturally understand that this is very much occurring by design. If that design is being created through the implementation of subconscious collectivism, it could be. If it's being implemented through some group of people behind a door sitting at a table, it could be as well. But the point is that it's so blatantly obvious, like you stated, that there is this desire to directly unlink men and women from one another. And that's such a powerful statement in itself to know that, because humanity has such capacity in its duality, and the duality that is the masculine and feminine, if it could merge and connect, then we would have such an easy time stepping into the new earth, and it would be so relaxed. And that's what a lot of people don't realize, is that when you're on the right path, everything falls into place and relaxes. A lot of people think they have to push and shove their way, which is an aspect of the dark masculine, into being, and that's not true. And so if you feel into what's happened lately, to me it feels very pushed and shoved into our faces, almost like something or someone is wanting us to feel like we have to engage in battle with one another. And also, if you step back from it all, it's also ridiculous, isn't it? The fact that people buzz about these things, yet I'm still happy to talk about them because they're obviously in the limelight for a reason. People are taking the bait, so let's figure out why. But yeah, I think it's a natural splintering into the essence of masculine and feminine potential. And I think if we identify that splinter and pluck it out, we could see a huge speed up in terms of our potentiated evolution.
Wow, Yeah, that's awesome and so well said. And see, viewer, this is what I'm talking about. Let's listen to what she just said and the way that she crafted her words. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks.
So one of the ways in which I personally have observed that there is a split going on is that this technological thing that has occurred, which is really new. There's been antagonism between men and women, which, in my opinion, has been fomented by social engineers for nefarious objectives. And behind the social engineers are, the people I believe rule the earth, right?
Yeah.
Are dark magicians, dark sorcerers,
Mm.
and they will use technology or money, right? Babylonian money magic, or they'll use
Mhm.
fame, Hollywood, or they'll use blackmail, right? Like Epstein stuff. They'll use
Yeah.
any means necessary in order to get control. But one of their favorite things is control of the narrative and the psychological warfare, basically. And so that has been
Yeah.
going on, in my estimation, between men and women since sometime in the 1950s or 60s. And it kind of like the real first obvious assault, in my estimation, is
Mhm.
second wave feminism, which was very, very hateful. It had a very hateful energy to it, which
Mhm.
isn't to say there is nothing to the idea that, we've lived under this dark, dark masculine, infernal masculine patriarchy
Mhm.
over the past, but during the Kali Yugas, as I often talk about, so the past like 5,700 years. That's certainly the case. There's been all
Mhm.
this rape, oppression of women, turning women into, slaves, virtual, literal or figurative, and
Right,
all of
right.
that critique. There was some value in it, but with all these
Mhm.
social engineering things where they Trojan horse in nefarious agendas, they use a veneer, or like the Trojan horse, they use an outside shell of
Mhm.
truth
Yeah.
in order to bring in a really poisonous ideology or mind virus. And for
Mhm.
me, second wave feminism started the ball rolling on that. Then there was
Mhm.
a reaction to that, which happened in the late 90s, which was a very nasty towards women and like anti-PC. There was the PC narrative, which they wanted, which now we have woke culture and cancel culture, which is the evolution of that political correctness. And so
Mhm.
critiquing that was correct, but these people like to control the narrative and the main counter narrative. And the counter narrative in the 90s was the Rush Limbaughs, the like kind of right-wing reactionaries who were saying all
Mhm.
this stuff. And so that kind of stuff has been going on for a while. This back and forth and psychological attacking stuff has been going on, in my estimation, since the 60s, approximately.
Mhm.
What is new and recent, and I think hasn't really been thoroughly examined, is what I call this dark trident that
Mhm.
attacks the masculine and the feminine and drives us apart. And that is contained within, and it's technological. So the dark technological trident, I suppose I should call it. So online porn, the
Mhm.
prevalence of online, especially hardcore pornography, meaning sex
Mhm.
acts, not just like naked women or naked men, but actual sex acts, um, social media,
Mhm.
and dating apps. And I think those three things have really, in a really nasty way, driven men and women apart. And do you have any thoughts, and you can, talk about any of those prongs, or just the
Mhm.
overview, or just what do you think about what I just posited
Mhm.
there?
Yeah, I agree that well, I also, let me say this first. I think that the splitting between masculine and feminine energies has been a mechanism for control since the beginning of the parasitic timeline. So, since the beginning that parasites attempted to take control of humanity. And I think that, we even see this in like biblical analogies like Adam and Eve. There's a splintering of the masculine, feminine in there, whatever. Not trying to say that I run by the Bible, I don't. But so that's occurred for a long time, right? And then this triad that you're talking about is really important to look at because it's demonstrating how much deeper we can split masculine, feminine consciousness over the ages of artificial intelligence takeover. And I think that there's many goals through that, but one of the primary goals would be to split masculine and feminine consciousness so deeply that people feel like they have no choice but to work with a machine in terms of romantic endeavor. So
Mm.
they'll get to a point where they feel like you know how everyone in the world is lonely. I don't know if you've realized that, but there's this epidemic where people are extremely lonely. That's by design, and it's to coerce the mind into believing that it has to engage with mechanical like structures to feel a sense of connection again. And they did this, of course, during Ovid K. I don't know if like I should say it, but whatever. They did
Yeah,
this
don't,
during like,
if you can
oh,
avoid it.
don't say it.
Sorry.
Oh, okay,
Yeah, do
okay.
not say the C word. I try and avoid
Oh,
it.
good to know.
Yeah,
Okay, really good to know. Okay.
yeah.
They did this the past couple years by telling everyone to stay home, by trying to enforce this sense of loneliness. And when you enforce loneliness, the looming presence of the technological world just is invited in by your heart. And so eventually, I think what they would like is for like women to feel like they only rely on machines. And I hate to say this, but there's a lot of females who already do. There's a lot of females who like have told me in confidence that they can only get stimulated by a little machine, that like a man can't help them anymore. And they've tried with a man, it doesn't work. That's because they've become addicted to the mechanical stimulation. And then I think they'll want to create this with men as well, to the point where we're just like dating AI. And I know that sounds a bit supreme, but it's meant to be, because it's meant to be future based. I'm not saying this is happening this year,
Mhm.
but I think your dark trident is like a arrow or a signal pointing to that looming potentiality that they would like to make a dystopian future. So that's a few things, but I think we could go down the rabbit hole with that, you know?
I think that that's an incredible insight, and I'll actually put up some pictures of articles. Like I've seen articles talking
Mm.
about women having like straight up android boyfriends, and like that going to the future. There's also like, since we're talking about this technological sexual slash romantic energies,
Mm.
I'm glad that you brought up vibrators. I've actually thought that for a long time and
Yeah.
felt that they were weirdly insidious, and it was
Mm-hmm.
sold to women as it was a way that they could ensure their sexual pleasure, which every woman is entitled to sexual pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
100%.
Yeah.
Let me be clear on
Mm-hmm.
that. And so are men. Whether you're
Mm-hmm.
not entitled to someone else giving you sexual pleasure, that you're not
Mm-hmm.
entitled to. That is earned.
Right.
But you're entitled
Mm-hmm.
to be able to pleasure yourself, right? Everyone
Totally.
can do
Yeah.
that if they want to. And I think everyone's entitled to pursue relationships that give them sexual pleasure. And that people, if you're a sexual being and you're not one of these
Mm-hmm.
asexual people, so I think most people are sexual beings, you're
Mm-hmm.
entitled to want in a partnership sexual
Yeah.
pleasure. And so I just want to state that, because I don't want to say, oh, like that kind of like sort of reactionary right wing thing of, there's some states that have tried to ban vibrators or whatever. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that that's the right way to do this. I think
Mm-hmm.
what you just described is a really important way of doing this. And what's interesting to me is about 15 or 20 years ago, there were a lot of articles showing that women can actually damage their clitoris with vibrators. There was science behind that. But then,
Mm-hmm.
not too long after that, I brought that up a while ago, and a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of women were like dogpiled me on some comment on Facebook, and I was
Mm-hmm.
kind of shocked by their vehemence, and then I was like, oh no, that makes sense. But what I was really surprised by was they had a
Mm-hmm.
raft of scientific articles going, oh no, you putting something that has 10,000 RPMs and vibrates super hard on the most
Mm-hmm.
sensitive, most nerve ending, intense part of your entire body, that doesn't do anything bad. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
what? But I remember all those articles that said it does do damage. It does permanent damage. How can that be? And I see now with what you're just saying, and they are moving in that direction. They've recently been rolling out more and more male stimulation devices.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, and so there is this, I think you're absolutely right, it's part of this transhumanist thing. And then there's this thing now called teledildonics, where a woman will have
Oh.
a vibrator that their
Mm-hmm.
partner, which is the less creepy version,
Mm-hmm.
or women will do
Mm-hmm.
sex shows, right, which is a
Wow.
dark feminine energy, where if you pay
Mm-hmm.
enough money, if the men pay enough money, they can then activate the vibrator in the woman, and she goes, oh, of course, because it's a very intense
Oh my God.
sensation. And it's called
Oh my
teledildonics, and they're
God.
now doing it in reverse. They're now having it
Mhm.
to where a woman can have and sorry to be so graphic, but where a woman can have a device that will then signal to the man's technological device that he has on, that
Oh
she
my
can do something
goodness.
on basically a dildo, right? And
Mhm.
it has sensors on it, and then that'll
Mhm.
translate and go to the man's doing that. So people can have completely remote
Wow.
sex via this thing called teledildonics, which is the most
Oh my
absurd
goodness.
word. And I can't even believe we're having this conversation, to be perfectly honest. But and it's kind of embarrassing, but there's so much weird and insane
Mhm.
stuff. And I
Mhm.
hadn't even completely thought about what you're saying, that it's moving in this transhumanist having sex with robots direction. And most of this
Mhm.
seems to be heavily targeted at women.
Mhm.
And if part of the agenda is to reduce population, you want to
Mhm.
target women primarily because women are the bottlenecks for population.
Mm.
With
Yeah.
hunting, they give out buck tags, and you can go out
Mhm.
there and kill as many bucks as you want, because all it needs is one buck, one very happy buck, to survive, and they can
Mhm.
repopulate all the deer. But in areas where the deer are overpopulating and eating farmland and stuff like that, then they give out doe tags. And that's a sign
Mm.
that, in the estimation of the whatever, I forget, the not EPA, but BLM, Bureau of Land Management, or whoever distributes these kind of hunting tags, in their estimation, there's overpopulation of deer, so then they target the females. So yeah, it seems like they're targeting women. And think about it: if you can make an android, that
Mhm.
android can have a fake penis that spins and vibrates and is forever
Mhm.
hard, and a robot will be able to defend you as good or better than men. So they'll be better
Mhm.
than men from a purely physical, materialist point of view.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I was having a conversation with a friend yesterday actually about how different planets, just like different aspects of nature, have different energies. So some aspects of nature have a more masculine or a more feminine energy. Like, for example, a mushroom would feel a bit more masculine because, well, like it looks like a penis, but also because it like pushes itself upward, it's kind of direct. And then a more feminine would be the flower where it's sort of receiving. I mean, we could just go on with analogies. And the reason I bring this up is because in the circle of spirituality, the earth is known to be more feminine based as a planet. And maybe there are planets out there that are more masculine based. Of course, there are. So, what we were talking about last night is how if you want to target a civilization or a species, if you want to hurt that species, and if you want to control that planet, then target its natural essence. So, its natural essence seems to be that of the feminist energy. Not to say there's not a lot of beautiful masculine energy here, too. And I feel like they go in for the females first almost. Like I almost feel like they target them first. And what's ironic though is when they target the females, it inevitably targets and puts a traumatic hue upon the males. So it's not like they're just getting at the females, they're getting at all of us when they target one of us. And I almost think the feminine sex thing is also a relay coming off the fact that um I think females have had a very confused sexual history in terms of their ancestry. And I think a lot of them are, traumatized, but there's a lot of men who are traumatized too. But I think for females, sometimes they just think, let me give up and just use this little machine. And they've done studies that show you can actually sensitize your vagina. Sorry, this is graphic as well, but
Oh,
you
please.
can, yeah, you can sensitize it into only wanting the vibrator and actually being repelled or wanting to repel like an actual human body. And this is really sad because um it's honestly like it feels like humanity's already fallen, to be honest. I'm not sitting here waiting for humanity to fall. I think it's already happened, and one of these examples that we're talking about is a perfect offshoot displaying how humanity has sort of fallen. And that doesn't mean we can't get back up again, because we sure can, but
We will.
we've fallen and this is a part of it, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think the reason the divine masculine has been targeted, as I talked about more in
Mm,
the first video, is the natural role of the male is to be a provider and a protector, and to potentially lay down your life to defend women and children, and perhaps the elderly or the weaker members of the tribe or the group or the society or the culture. And that's sort of you know, you see it in nature that that is the job of the male. It's the male that usually, among mammals, not always, but usually, is the one that will defend. If a predator comes in, it'll be the males that fight the predator and that try and will be willing to sacrifice themselves in order to keep the females and their off and the males offspring going. But certainly in humans, our history and everything we know from indigenous people, whatever, is that the males protect the females and children. So that's the part of the divine masculine essence. So the divine masculine is attacked by saddling men into this dark masculine predator, you know, warlock, F-boy, player, pickup artist, kind of manipulator guy, you know, CEO, throat cutting kind of guy. And then also they try and put men into, they're like, oh, you don't like this? Well, maybe you'd like being this nice guy, this simp, you know, be nice to women, you know, like sidle up to women, and then, you know, like try and worm your way into their affections rather than being direct and masculine and saying what you want. So you do that to men, get them in those two, so they become tacit allies in the, you know, continuing to spread this rape energy, really, right? A lot of the metaphors you've been using about like the pushing into the world, you know, like that is
yeah,
it has a non-consent rape energy to it. You were saying that at the
absolutely.
beginning, that the dark masculine pushing into the world, and this how this social engineering is being pushed into us. I mean,
Definitely.
that's dark masculine, and that's a rape energy. So you have your tacit allies, these players and pickup artists, scumbag guys who are going around traumatizing women and making women not trust men, making women think the only way they can be safe is to rely on the state or corporations or private security or whatever, or robots eventually, right?
Yeah,
And over here you have these other men where you're like, well, if you're not going to help us, lay down your arms and become weak and
right.
stop defending and protecting women, start being ineffectual, stop being something that where women feel safe by your masculine presence. Because the real goal is the women. The real goal is the women and the girls and the children, because children can be programmed either sex, and
Yeah,
women and
definitely.
girls are the ones who hold the divine frequency. I love what you're saying, the frequency of Gaia, really. And it
Yeah.
makes perfect sense to me. And I mean, are you taking it from an interdimensional perspective or an exopolitics, like extraterrestrial direction, when you were saying the attacking of our planet? Extraterrestrial, I'm guessing. Is that
Mm.
right?
Um, I don't know. I kind of see them as merging to be both at times. I don't know if that makes sense. Let me know if it doesn't, because
No, please.
sometimes it doesn't. But I feel like there's a level of political energy that's always been sort of influenced by other planetary energy. And I mean, I think even in modern day science, they talk about how like certain things that appear on the earth weren't of this earth. So it's like, well, Earth has been invaded, even according to the MSM, the mainstream, by different organisms. I think something about octopus or octopi,
Yes.
I don't know. But and I love those creatures, by the way. But like, anyways, I do feel that there's so many different realms and layers of influence, and some of those could be grouped into that. And these layers contribute to a deeply subliminal enslaved mindset that abides by the dark aspect of its collective psyche. So it's not even aware, but it's tapping into interdimensional like collectivism. Does that make any sense, or is that
Yeah.
confusing? Because
No, it
okay,
makes sense to me.
okay,
Yeah. Please, can you?
okay.
We get weird on this channel, so please open the kimono, let people know whatever you think, and don't worry about like if people don't like it. I mean, I always tell people when they watch this show, investigate everything for yourself, take what resonates, leave what doesn't. Don't ever
Yeah.
take me or any of my guests, you know, opinions or beliefs or experiences as the truth in all caps, TM.
Definitely. Yeah.
I strive to move towards what I feel is truth, but I also recognize that there is an objective truth, but that is only
Mhm.
for enlightened beings, and that everyone else is maybe sharing their glimpses of that and their subjective
Mhm.
truth. So please, Mary Allison, feel
Thank
completely
you.
free to speak on any topic you wish.
I really appreciate that. And I agree with everything you said. And I also wanted to backtrack and just mention
Please.
if there is a female watching and you do use a vibrator, like this isn't an attack on you. It's just a theory that maybe that vibrator could lead to something in the future and maybe not too. And I've used one before as well. So this isn't like, oh my gosh, you're evil. It's more like, hey, what is this? And could we look at this a different way and be more healthier? But yeah, so what I think is that Earth is an experimentation zone. And I don't think that Earth wants to be an experimentation zone. I think Earth wants to be autonomous. And I think every day when we fight for or look for a sense of liberation, it's not just us looking for that, it's the Earth looking through us for that. And so what's happened is if you want to enslave someone or keep them limited, you come at them in a penetrating manner. And I'm aware that the dark masculine can do this, of course, but the dark feminine does this as well. And we could lay out examples of that as well soon. And what these dark aspects of the masculine and feminine do is they try to force an ideology or mindset into the mind. And if they're doing that to us humans, which they obviously are, they're also attempting to do that to the energetic field of the earth. So
Mm.
they're trying to convince this home that we live upon, you have to be enslaved to a particular degree. And so then humanity feels more like a parasitic force than a good one. But deep down, there's this beautiful struggle occurring because human consciousness knows it can be a steward of the earth rather than be a parasite to it. And that's what the new earth will be, is us being stewards instead. So I just say that because there's so many interdimensional layers that have come to this world to sort of play with it. And I really think these different layers are battling one another. They're different factions battling one another. The whole Hollywood-esque idea that there's a good guy and a bad guy, essentially outdated at this point. We understand there's so many different categories of people trying to get their egoic fulfillment. And that's why when you're on the spiritual journey, it can almost feel impossible sometimes to meet people who are very pure in their heart, because there's so many different offshoots of the ego that attempt to persuade the mind to be possessed by ideologies that are not actually of the highest intention. So a lot of these like offshoots of revolution that are occurring right now aren't actually revolution. They're just different ways for the ego to implement control over humanity and then eventually control over the earth that we live upon. So those are just a few things, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, and feel free to say, ask anything if anything's confusing too.
Yeah, no, I think that's very well said. And so do you one question I have for you is, do you see a difference? It sounds like maybe you do not. Someone I want to have on the show at some point is this man named Mark Stavish, and he wrote this book on egregors that I really like. And he said he would come on anyone's show who wants to talk with that about him with that book. And so I'm gonna try and have him on at some point. But the egregor, are you familiar with the concept of the egregor? And I'm going to explain it for the viewer, even if you.
Yeah, I actually haven't heard that word before, so I'd love to learn
So
about it.
it's an occult term, and it's essentially
Mhm.
it's the belief that if enough minds focus on a certain kind of thought form or cluster of
Mm.
thought forms, that it takes on eventually a life of its own.
Mhm.
And that some amount of the deities, not all of them, but some of the amount of the deities that humans have had at various different times have actually been this concept of the egregor. And so let me give you an example. It's anything that the collective unconscious, and they can be created intentionally by a group of magicians, for example, or even a
Mhm.
singular magician can maybe start to create one, although that's a little more similar to the Tibetan concept of a tulpa, which is where
Mhm.
your own mind can create this being that then
Oh yeah.
consciousness of its own, and it has free will and can do its own thing. You can control a very limited form one that doesn't really have consciousness and is more robotic in nature, something called a servitor. That's another occult or magical concept. So sort of like the golem that is discussed. I don't know if the golem's in the Bible. It's maybe just a Jewish myth or whatever, but they constructed this basically robot that went and defended the Jews in I want to say the Czech Republic, if I recall correctly. So the servitor is more kind of in that class of this automaton that's sort of almost like a wind-up toy, or its program doesn't have a lot of consciousness on. A tulpa has its own consciousness, and an egregore tends to be, and I think it might require a group mind. A number of humans have put their mind into to where it then takes on a life of its own. And so there's an egregore around Shia Islam. There's an egregore around Sunni Islam. There's an egregore around Catholicism. There's an egregore around, you're in the United Kingdom, the British Empire, right? The United States. There's egregores that form around sports teams. There's egregores that form around corporations, right? And branding and all that stuff. And there's egregores around certain concepts. Like, I believe of one of the more powerful egregores in the world that I believe a great many people fall afoul of is there's an egregore of people who argue about, oh, this word was coined by a Jewish communist, blah, 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 but anti-Semitism. So I'll even rephrase that, the hating of Jewish people. There's an egregore around that. And just because an egregore forms doesn't mean that the underlying beliefs are wrong or incorrect or whatever. That one I don't like because it has an energy of hating all people by virtue of their blood and background as opposed to their individual content of their character. But, there being an egregore around Catholicism is neither good nor bad. But then this energy, this group mind thing, the egregore begins to exert control over the people who identify with it. And it can actually really drive people's minds. And so I've actually forgotten why I brought this up. Mark Stavish says that he thinks that most UFOs, and when people see extraterrestrials or whatever, that they are not, in fact, physical beings like us from another planet, but they're actually extra-dimensional beings that have maybe existed here on Earth or interacted with the Earth at various times to varying degrees, that are from different dimensions, as opposed to being beings who are physical beings that travel across space and time to Earth. He is of the opinion, and I don't necessarily agree with this, although I'm open to it, that basically all of that is what used to be called demons or asuras or angels or devas or fairies or all these different things of these extra-dimensional beings that are in a certain sense native to a space that's adjacent to Earth, as opposed to being here on Earth, but then they can come in and penetrate here. And that to me is what an interdimensional being is, as opposed to an extraterrestrial would be someone who came from Alpha Centauri or the Pleiades or Sirius or I forget what Orion's belt. I think it is. Oh no, it's Betelgeuse is in Orion's belt, or like the Betelgeuse solar system from Orion's belt. So there's a lot of people talk about star seeds and that kind of stuff. So I'm curious, and sorry to be lengthy, because I actually really do want to give you lots of talking time in this, but as my viewers know, I can't help but pontificate. So what are your thoughts on that? And where are your beliefs? And it can be both or neither, whatever. Where are your beliefs in terms of, you talked about a force that seems other than human, that is directed, and I agree. I believe that deities have a huge influence on Earth. I also believe other interdimensional beings like the jinn and also fairies, and I also believe that there's extraterrestrial influence on Earth, though I think most UFOs people see are actually humans driving them. But
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I love what you're talking about. I didn't know that it was called egregore. There's a book called have you read the Magus of Strovolos before? It's about this Italian shaman who teaches people how to essentially heal, and he talks about how the subconscious creates thought forms and how those thought forms can group up to create bigger thought forms. So it's kind of the egregore without the word egregor.
Mhm.
And my initial instinct is that everything's multi-layered. So there's perhaps genuine forms of energy. There's also genuine not forms of energy. So in the Middle East, they would refer to the jinn as being this spirit that could morph at will and be whatever you wanted it to be, which is why some people have said before that mediumship can be very dangerous because you could be interacting with a false spirit rather than the actual soul, or not. I don't know. But and my I guess my answer is I don't know. However, I do feel like at the core of it all, something happened within our souls collectively where we forgot how part of source we were. We forgot how connected to love we were. And through this disconnect of love, we formed this huge egregore, I guess I would call it, this huge aspect of the collective psyche that wants to torment itself. And so, as this aspect of the collective psyche formed, it became lusty for blood, for darkness, for violence, for vengeance upon its own self. Maybe it was a part of us we neglected collectively or something, probably. And
Mhm.
as that occurred, I feel like groups of people who maybe wanted to feel egoic power clung to that energy, and that energy clung to them. And then you have this parasitic clinging together. So it's almost like a symbiotic parasitism where the two parasites are working together to be parasites off of humankind. And I always come back to humankind having so much potential in its own accountability, because if humankind realizes that there's a part of us within our psyche that has felt severed from love, then humankind might be able to change that egregore and that aspect of the collective unconscious that essentially hates itself. So I think at the core of this is group self-hatred. And I
Mhm.
would be more interested in studying the group self-hatred emotionally than the actual phantom spirits or energies that come from it. But that doesn't mean that some things aren't real at the same time. I think that if something exists, and it exists in totality, so it's a common existence, it might have been based off of something real. So it could be that we have egregore concepts that were based off of actual UFOs, or like concepts of fairies that were based off of actual fairies. It could be something like that. Again, I'm not really sure, to be honest, but I'm more interested in why we hate ourselves and
Yeah.
what went wrong there, you know?
Yeah. No,
Mhm.
I, I, I think that that is like the $64 trillion question is how did we sort of get to this state? And I think more importantly, how do we liberate ourselves from it? I'm of the personal belief that we talked about off camera before we started that the Kali Yugas are coming to an end,
Mhm.
and that
Yeah.
there will be a transitional period that lasts, I guess, 300 years. So none of us will
Mhm.
truly see the uh, well, I mean, maybe there'll be stuff that extends life. Who knows? But I think more than
Yeah.
likely, probably nobody viewing this will see the actual clean and separate
Mhm.
version of the Dwarpa Yuga or the Bronze Age. But things are going to change rapidly. The next few years, I believe, are going to unfortunately be rather difficult. That's why I often tell my viewers to just take
Mhm.
common sense precautions, around their finances and having food and water, and if possible, move out of cities. But definitely one thing everybody can do is build community, start
Mhm.
strengthening your relationships with other people, because I do think things are going to get rough for actually not that long. I think it'll be 2 or 3 years of extreme intensity, and then there'll be a period of fallout from that intensity and from things
Mhm.
like the pokey that has,
Mhm.
I think, just begun to. We've just seen the tip of the iceberg of the devastation that that's going to wreak upon the world. And there are ways, viewers, if you had to take that or you chose to take that because you trusted people and didn't
Mhm.
realize, like, there's ways to remediate that. And so
Mhm.
don't give up hope just because you did that. But there is going to be a lot of people who are continuing to take more. And I will say, do not take more. If you've taken them, do not take more, and do not give them to your children. Um, and especially because of, I do believe there's a population population crash coming. I think it's extra important for females to guard themselves, because one of the things it seems to do is harm fertility. But in about 3 years' time, there's going to be a big shift that will begin to occur. There'll be a fallout from all this bad stuff that has happened and that is going to happen with things like economics and geopolitics. But I really do believe that by 2030, things will be moving in a dramatically better direction that will be very noticeable. But that doesn't mean that we'll just be like, yay, everything will be great, everything will be fixed. I think you'll see the outlines of that things will be getting better and better from that point. But I do think that these next few years are going to be really challenging. And I think it's really important for people to start to do that inner work, the shadow integration, and getting in touch with that loving connection of source, in part because you will become then less reactionary when you do that kind of healing. And when you're less reactionary, you'll be able to be in the flow state that allows you to navigate that kind of chaos that, unfortunately, I think is en route. I think most people who are paying attention recognize what's occurring currently, and the systems that have been in place for a long time, they cannot continue. They simply cannot. And what's more, if you're really dialed in, like I fancy myself to be, you will see that there is a planned demolition of those systems. For nefarious purposes, the group that I call the Malachians want to create this totalitarian, top-down, forever, cradle-to-grave control system. They will fail. I'm certain of that. Their time is rapidly approaching an end. That's why if you really feel into it and smell into it, you can smell a whiff of desperation. You can also see how the glamour magic has fallen away from them. They had glamour for a long time to where people trusted them, and people would go along with even madness that was against their own interest. That spell has been broken. Yes, there's still people who are completely hypnotized by it, but more and more people are waking up to that aspect of things. And so the problem is that group, even though they're going to fail, they're not going out without a fight. They've been running things on the planet for almost 6,000 years, for about 5,700 years, and they don't want to give up control. Control and enslavement of others is kind of like their raison d'etre. It's their reason for existing. It's what they do. It's who they are. And so that group's going to go away, but they're not going to go away without a fight. And they're going to, like a child that's tantruming and starts breaking stuff in the house, they're going to do damage. And so the way to navigate that chaos and sort of surf that wave is to do that kind of internal work that so much of your work is about. And by the way, viewer, find Mary Allison on Facebook and read her writings. Her writings are superb. They're so good. And she's really excellent about leading people back to themselves, and then from there deeper into source. And to me, that is the key towards us evolving. And I agree with Mary Allison on a certain sense that humanity has fallen, but I also believe in the principle of resurrection, and that we will resurrect, because the old version of humanity actually needs to die. Time is over. The Kali Yuga era human must go away, and the Dwarpa or Bronze Age Yuga that's now ascending towards that next golden age, that must be who we become. And just as initiates in ancient mystery schools would have a symbolic or sometimes a psychedelic influenced death, and then would be pulled up out of the coffin. That's what the sarcophagus is for in the king's chamber in Egypt, by the way, viewer. When that person would be pulled up out of that, having experienced a symbolic death, or maybe having an induced death of psychedelics. The Dionysian cult in Greece had this, where they would be dead. They would basically be in sort of a medically induced coma that also allowed them to project out of their bodies. They would then know that death, as we understand it, is not the end, that they were an immortal soul. And then when they came back to their body, they would be reborn. They would be reborn as a human who understood this thing, that death was not the end, that it was simply a barrier of transition. And so in that sense, the Kali Yuga era human needs to die in order for the Dwapara Yuga or the Bronze Age human to emerge. And you know, for what Mary Allison talks about, the new earth that we're going to be building towards. And I actually, despite I just said some scary stuff, I'm super looking forward to a decade from now, because we're going to be starting to build and put into place stuff that's just so much better and more uplifting. And the way to get there is through the kind of stuff that the kind of work that Mary Allison does. And do you have any comments on what I just said?
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that just naturally arises is the notion that there is a collective mind and a collective energy. You also have autonomy within your own mind to not be as stuck or meshed into the collective. And I would almost debate the idea, or not debate it, but put forth the idea that humanity itself is one massive trauma bond. And social media is an extension of that trauma bond. So your
Mm,
friends want you to watch these stupid videos or get involved in these things that are contrasting and that are provoking and triggering. And so your sympathetic nervous system gets
ooh,
really charged up. And before you know it, you're being plugged into that collective trauma bond of
wow.
false duality that doesn't have to occur. And I will say this, maybe this could help some people. So it's important for us in the next few years, really for the rest of our lives, to learn how to not be caught up in the net and the webbing that is the collective's trauma. And ironically, when we don't get caught up in that, that's how we actually help the collective to heal. It's just like in psychology when you do parts work, which is when you split the mind into different parts and you let them communicate with each other. So you could have the part of the mind that's very nurturing and loving and that's listening to you. And then you have another part of the mind that's just angry and losing its shit. So these two parts, when you let them have their own independence, they actually help one another heal. The divine rage helps the nurtured part to feel more alive in its emotions. The nurtured part lets the divine rage feel more safe and accepted. And a lot of what we're trying to do in this collective reality for the new earth has to start inside the head. And I think the biggest criticism I would have of like, this isn't towards you, by the way, Ian, this is towards just people I've noticed on social media. Um, the truther community, the conspiratorial community, they're so locked in and engaged in the collective trauma that they actually feed it sometimes even more
Yes.
than people who are not as aware of what's happening. And I admire them for being able to look at another version of reality, another version of truth. That's really courageous. But you cannot get lost in the trauma bond of it, because if you do, you intermesh the mind, the collective mind together before it becomes this entropic sort of disease unto itself.
Mm,
And the collective becomes very confused in its trauma. It's just like when that sympathetic nervous system gets kicked into fight or flight, the main consensus within it is I'm confused. And I've never met a traumatized individual who didn't go through confusion during their trauma. So confusion is paramount to trauma reaction. And so what we have to do is go, okay, let's not confuse the collective anymore. Let's pull back and station ourselves in a very zen place and listen to the collective and honor it, but not contribute to the confusion by picking sides. And it's hard because it's like you don't want to pick sides in terms of the trauma bond, but you do want to pick sides in terms of your own sovereignty. So when it comes to the like prick, I will say no, not for me. I'm choosing a side, and that's that I feel it's unhealthy. Absolutely not. However, when it comes to different aspects of trauma bonding, you don't need to, like, for example, the slap, the Will Smith slap, we don't really need to pick sides there. It's ridiculous. And I think a matured mind understands when something is serious versus when something is just someone trying to blow off some energy. And I will say, if you study like narcissism, which has unfortunately been misused in this reality, because they're using narcissism as a way to divide females and males. But I will say our entire society is narcissist to a degree. Self-absorption is an incredibly common quality I see in some of the clients I work with, and no judgments towards them. It's just something they're growing through. I've seen it in myself. I've seen it in people I love. Self-absorption is a phenomenon, and yet we point at one another. You're a narcissist, you're a narcissist. But what I was saying is that narcissists, like personalities, which is probably a lot of people at this point because Earth is confused, has this way of trying to create drama out of nothing. And if you've ever been in like an abusive situation, you know that the abuser likes to, if needed, create drama just so it can spook the nervous system into being caught in that fight or flight. Because that, entrapment in the fight or flight space, it actually creates hormonal imbalances, hormonal issues where you can have like organ issues, headaches. You can have all sorts of issues being present. And most importantly, you cannot heal when you're in a constant state of fight or flight. So in the next few years or whatever, I don't know. I don't really know what's happening, but I can tell that we are going to be pushed into trauma states. And if we can find a way to move through the fight or flight by holistically approaching it and doing our own inner work around it, then we can greatly assist this reality. And also just not getting involved in distracting mechanisms that attempt to pull our focus away from creating a better reality. And I do agree that there's like an air of desperation. I also feel that there's an air of confidence though, because there's different factions working amongst this battle. And the sort of crazy faction that's tried to, I don't know, rule American politics for a super long time, that seems to be losing its grip. So I think that there's another faction that might want the American political arena to just collapse in on itself, because everything's done by design, of course. And why would Joe Biden be put in a position of power unless we wanted to think the American political system was over? Clearly, I mean, he's no hero, no leader. And I also would say most of the presidents behind him weren't the presidents, but he's more blatantly and obviously not fit for that heroic energy title. And so I think there's a faction that just wants that world to collapse in on itself. And that faction seems confident to me. The other faction doesn't. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I'm feeling.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting and super on point. I really like the thing you said something at the very beginning, which was, oh yeah, where you said social media is an extension of the collective unconscious trauma bond of humanity. And I think you're so right. And by the way, I will just say, like, openly admit to it and cop to it. I do sometimes do what Mary Allison is talking about and feed into some of that stuff, especially where I'm like trying to examine, just the way that the mental part of my mind works, the puzzle of it, of like wanting to know who rules the world, and like being interested in the Venetian black nobility and wanting people to understand who they are and where they came from and why I think they're the people who are like the number one most powerful faction for the past, like, at least 500 years, but even like, as many as like 3 or 4,000 years. That, and I sometimes also call them, and they're somewhat synonymous, although they're a particular aspect of the Molochian group of, sometimes called the satanic group that runs things, which is very materializing, believes in Epstein style harm of children, sacrifice of children, slavery. They're really big into slavery, that total control thing. I see that faction, which is global and has various different factions even within itself, as being a combination of supremely confident because they're kind of dumb, and also the smarter ones among them are the ones who are desperate. And then there's another faction that I call the Luciferians, which are far more intelligent and far more creative and actually more liberty oriented, but they are a false light. They're not the answer. They, in my estimation, and based on various different esoteric sources, I will just leave it at that, that is who I believe will rule the Bronze and Silver Ages as we move towards a Golden Age, where then the Most High, the God of the angels, will then rule for that 6,000 year period, and we'll have a beautiful, like truly harmonious, like probably psychically connected, true equality, and not in a nightmarish communist way, but in an actually beautiful way, where when we'll be evolved enough spiritually to do that without any agendas. I believe that that's what will happen then. But this Luciferian group, which is very much about technology and science, not nonsense science slapped on a propaganda campaign, but actual scientific method. The energy of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution of the United States, that's all this Luciferian impulse. And they still believe in top-down control in a certain sense, or hierarchy is better put, merit-based hierarchy, actually. It's kind of a libertarian mindset as opposed to a slavery mindset. So meritocracy, but still hierarchy and still control. It'll be more subtle, but that group is supremely confident because that group is going to win, and they're far more clever than the Malachians, and they are able to be creative. They're still limited because it's still an egoic energy, like Mary Allison's been talking about, whereas the Most High energy is an energy of transcendence, where you've transcended good and evil, really, actually, which is the ultimate good, and you're directly connected to source, and so therefore you're in harmony, and you recognize that love is the true nature of the universe. And that's what we're eventually moving towards. And there'll be people who are, we've even had emissaries during the Kali Yugas of that energy. In my estimation, Yeshua or Jesus, Pythagoras, Buddha, Lao Tzu, Kuan Yin. There's probably been a lot of women that we've lost their names who have had this energy. So Mary Magdalene, perhaps, and Jesus's mother Mary. Those are at least archetypal groups that emanated that energy of this Most High thing. And I think that there's people right now who are emanating or moving towards that energy, and I believe Mary Allison is moving towards that energy. Part of the reason I wanted to have her on the show, and when we do part 2, because we're going to cut part 1 here shortly, I'm going to ask Mary Allison to give me as much description she wants to go into of what she believes the divine feminine is from a woman's point of view, who, in my opinion, Mary Allison is very wonderfully radiant and feminine, and has that light but super strong, resolute, feminine energy come off of her. And there's other people. I've had Sammy Richard on in the past. I believe he emanates this Most High energy, and he's moving in that direction. There's a number of spiritual teachers out there, like I'm a big fan of Adyashanti. He's deceased now, but Ramana Maharshi absolutely was. If people know who that is, if you don't, take a look. Nisargadatta Maharaj, he was kind of a more somehow harsh version of that, but he really emanated that energy. So there's been emissaries and people who have brought this energy through, even during the Kali Yuga. But that energy, instead of being rare, will be the standard in the Golden Age. But as we move up, people are going to be more spiritual and starting to move in that direction. And inevitably, this Luciferian energy, which is more egoic, will eventually have no choice but to cede to the Golden Age energy. And it's like a necessary next step. We've gone through the staring into the abyss. We've gone through the trauma bond. We've gone through the enslaving each other and murdering each other and genocide and rape and torture and Epstein-style harm of children. We've done that. We've learned all the karmic lessons we need to as humanity. And now we're in a state, in my opinion, where we're balancing the karmic accounting book of all the stuff that's happened since the fall of Atlantis through now. And what we're about to embark on as we clear this energy is a new cycle. It apparently weirdly seems to start with the beginning of the Bronze Age, according to what angels and so forth and other deities have told me, that all the karma of the past, basically since the last Bronze Age, is culminating now and has been culminating throughout the Kali Yugas. And this nasty energy we have with one another, it's a way of quickly unraveling this karma, so a new tone, a new octave can be reached, and then we can explore a new thing during that upcoming cycle that will repeat. And so do you have any comment on that? And then I think maybe you and I will take a break, and then we'll launch into part two. I want to go deeper on a few different things you've touched on, and especially the divine feminine.
Yeah, that'll be lovely. And yeah, I find that very intriguing, and I feel like I feel like this entire process, if you look at it from a psycho-spiritual perspective, through the Carl Yugas, is essentially the human's collective field and the Earth's field learning how to forgive itself. And we learn how to forgive ourselves through different factions of the psyche. So I go from being, maybe if I'm very traumatized, someone would go from being very manic, catatonic, and crazed, where they cannot think and process. And so once they go through that stage, they maybe get to a stage where they're still fragmented and a bit, dark and manipulative, but they also have a new awareness and maybe perhaps genius about them. They've learned from the past trauma. And then from there, you get to a state where you drop the need to be as manipulative. You're maybe still a little bit unaware, and a little bit not clued in on your own ego, but you're a little bit more open to feedback than you would have been. So you're a bit more humble. And then from there, you have a pure stage of just complete love that is absolutely able to take in feedback, healthy criticism, because it wants to be the best it can be, and it wants to be in service not only for humanity and the earth, but of source. So it's fascinating to watch this on a macro level with humanity, really. So I'll end on that. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And viewer, well, I'm gonna actually cut the video into two parts, and so
Cool.
we're gonna end here on that. And things, as always, kind of went in a different direction than I thought, but I thought it was amazing. And thank you so much, Mary Allison. And so you and I will take a break here, and then viewers, like in about a week after you see this one, there'll be the next one up of all have been able to edit the part two of this conversation with Mary Allison. So see you then, and thanks for tuning in. All right.